All right, I'm back again. We're on Tragedy and Hope, page 236. Diplomatic History, 1914 to 1918. Okay. The beginnings of military action in August 1914 did not mark the end of diplomatic action, even between the chief opponents. Diplomatic activity continued and was aimed very largely at two goals: A, to bring new countries into the military activities, or, on the contrary, to keep them out, and B, to attempt to make peace by negotiations. Closely related to the first of these aims were negotiations concerned with the disposition of enemy territories after the fighting ceased. Back of all the diplomatic activities of the period 1914 to 1918 was a fact which impressed itself upon the belligerents relatively slowly. This was the changed character of modern warfare. With certain exceptions, the wars of the 18th and early 19th centuries has been struggles of limited resources for limited objectives. The growth of political democracy, the rise of nationalism, and the industrialization of war led to total war with total mobilization and unlimited objectives. In the 18th century, when rulers were relatively free from popular influences, they could wage wars for limited objectives and could negotiate peace on a compromise basis when these were objectives were attained or appeared unattainable. That's a weird sentence. When these were objectives were attained or appeared unattainable. That's the sentence. It's on page 236. Using a mercenary army which fought for pay, they could put that army into war or out of war as seemed necessary, without vitally affecting its morale or its fighting qualities. The arrival of democracy and the mass army required that the great body of the citizens give wholehearted support for any war effort, and made it impossible to wage war for limited objectives. Such popular support could be won only in behalf of great moral goals or universal philosophic values, or at the very least for survival. At the same time, the growing industrialization and economic integration of modern society made it impossible to mobilize for war except on a very extensive basis which approached total mobilization. This mobilization could not be directed towards limited objectives. From these factors came total war with total mobilization and unlimited objectives, including the total destruction or unconditional surrender of the enemy. Having adopted such grandiose goals and such gigantic plans, it became almost impossible to allow the continued existence of non-combatants within the belligerent countries or neutrals outside them. It became almost axiomatic that who is not with me is against me. And at the same time, it became almost impossible to compromise sufficiently to obtain the much more limited goals which would permit a negotiated peace. As Charles Seymour puts it, each side has promised itself a piece of victory. The very phrase negotiated peace became synonymous with treachery. Moreover, the popular basis of modern war required a high morale which might easily be lowered if the news leaked out that the government was negotiating peace in the middle of the fighting. As a consequence of these conditions, efforts to negotiate peace during the First World War were generally very secret and very unsuccessful. The change from limited wars with limited objectives fought with mercenary troops to unlimited wars of economic attrition with unlimited objectives fought with national armies had far-reaching consequences. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants and between belligerents and neutrals became blurred and ultimately undistinguishable. International law, which had grown up in the period of limited dynastic wars, made a great deal of these distinctions. Non-combatants had extensive rights which sought to protect their ways of life as much as possible during periods of warfare. Neutrals had similar rights. In return, strict duties to remain both non-combatant and neutral rested on these outsiders. All these distinctions broke down in 1914 to 1915, with the result that both sides indulged in wholesale violation of existing international law. Probably on the whole, these violations were more extensive, although less widely publicized, on the part of the Entente than on the part of the Central Powers. The reason for this were that Germans still maintained the older traditions of a professional army, and their position both as an invader and as central power with limited manpower and economic resources made it to their advantage to maintain the distinction between combatants and non-combatant and between belligerent and neutral. If they could have maintained the former distinction, they would have had to fight the enemy army and not the enemy civilian population, and once the former was defeated, would have little to fear from the latter, which could have been controlled by a minimum of troops. If they could have maintained the distinction between belligerent and neutral, it would have been impossible to blockade Germany, since basic supplies could have been imported through neutral countries. It was for this reason that Schleffen's original plans for an attack on France through Holland and Belgium were changed by Moltke to an attack through Belgium alone. Neutral Holland was to remain as a channel of supply for civilian goods. This was possible because international law made a distinction between war goods, which could be declared contraband, and civilian goods, including food, which could not be so declared. Moreover, the German plans, as we have indicated, called for a short, decisive war against the enemy armed forces, and they neither expected nor desired a total economic mobilization or even a total military mobilization, since these might disrupt the existing social and political structure of Germany. For these reasons, Germany made no plans for industrial or economic mobilization for a long war, or for withstanding a blockade, and hoped to mobilize a smaller proportion of its manpower than its immediate enemies. The failure of Schleffen's plan showed the error of these ideas. Not only did the prospect of a long war make economic mobilization necessary, but the occupation of Belgium showed that national feelings was tending to make the distinction between combatant and non-combatant academic. When Belgian civilians shot at German soldiers, the latter took civilian hostages and practiced reprisals on civilians. These German actions were publicized throughout the world by both the British propaganda machine as atrocities and violations of international law, which they were, while the Belgian civilian snipers were excused as loyal patriots, although their actions were even more clearly violations of international law, and, as such, justified severe German reactions. These atrocities were used by the British to justify their own violations of international law. As early as August 20th, 1914, they were treating food as contraband and interfering with neutral shipments of food to Europe. On November 5th, 1914, they declared the whole sea from Scotland to Iceland a war zone, covered it with fields of explosive floating mines, and ordered all ships going to the Baltic, Scandinavia, or the Low Countries to go by way of the English Channel, where they were stopped, searched, and much of their cargoes seized, even when these cargoes cannot be declared contraband under existing international law. The reprisal of Germans on February 18, 1915, declared the English Channel a war zone, announced that their submarines would sink shipping in that area, and ordered shipping for the Baltic Sea to use the route north of Scotland. The United States, which rejected a Scandinavian invitation to protest against the British war zone, closed with mines north of Scotland, protested violently against the German war zone closed with submarines on the narrow seas, although, as one American senator put it, the humanity of the submarine was certainly on a higher level than that of the floating mine, which could exercise neither discretion nor judgment. The United States accepted the British war zone and prevented its ships from using it. On the other hand, it refused to accept the German war zone and insisted that American lives and property were under American protection even when traveling on armed belligerent ships in this war zone. Moreover, the United States insisted that German submarines must obey the laws of the sea as drawn for surface vessels. These laws provided that merchant ships could not be stopped by a war vessel and inspected and could be sunk if carrying contraband after the passengers and the ship's papers were put in a place of safety. A place of safety was not the ship's boats, except in sight of land or of other vessels in the calm sea. The merchant vessel so stopped obtained these rights only if it made no act of hostility against the enemy war vessel. It was not only difficult or impossible for German submarines to meet these conditions, it was often dangerous, since British merchant ships received instructions to attack German submarines at sight by ramming if possible. It was even dangerous for the German submarines to apply the established law of neutral vessels, for British vessels with these aggressive orders frequently flew neutral flags and posted as neutrals as long as possible. Nevertheless, the United States continued to insist that the Germans obey the old laws while condoning British violations of the same laws to the extent that the distinction between war vessels and merchant ships was blurred. Accordingly, German submarines began to sink British merchant ships with little or no warning. Their attempts to justify this failure to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants on the ground that British floating mines, the British food blockade, and British instructions to merchant ships to attack submarines made no such distinctions were no more successful than their efforts to show that their severity against the civilian population of Belgium was justified by civilian attacks on German troops. They were trying to carry on legal distinctions remaining from an earlier period when conditions were entirely different, and their ultimate abandonment of these distinctions on the grounds that their enemies had already abandoned them merely made matters worse, because if neutrals became belligerents and non-combatants became combatants, Germany and her allies would suffer much more than Britain and her friends. In the final analysis, this is why the distinctions were destroyed, but beneath all legal questions was to be found the ominous fact that war, by becoming total, had made both neutrality and negotiated peace almost impossible. We shall now turn our attention to the struggle over neutrality and the struggle over negotiated peace. So far as legal or diplomatic commitments went, Germany, in July 1914, had the right to expect that Austria-Hungary, Italy, Romania, and perhaps Turkey would be at her side, and that her opponents would consist of Serbia, Montenegro, Russia, and France, with England maintaining neutrality at the beginning, at least. Instead, Italy, Romania fought against her, a loss which was not balanced by the accession of Bulgaria to her side. In addition, she found her opponents reinforced by England, Belgium, Greece, the United States, China, Japan, the Arabs, and who else? 20 other allied and associated powers. The process by which the reality turned out to be so different from Germany's legitimate expectations will now take our attention. Turkey, which had been growing closer to Germany since before 1890, offered Germany an alliance on July 27, 1914, when Sarajevo crisis was at its height. The document was signed secretly on August 1st and bound Turkey to enter the war against Russia if Russia attacked Germany or Austria. In the meantime, Turkey deceived the Entente powers by conducting long negotiations with them regarding its attitude towards the war. On October 29th, it removed its mask of neutrality by attacking Russia, thus cutting her off from the Western Allies by the southern route. To relieve the pressure on Russia, the British made an ineffectual attack on Gallipoli at the Dardanelles, February to December 1915. Only at the end of 1916 did any real attack on Turkey begin, this time from Egypt into Mesopotamia, where Baghdad was captured in March 1917, and the way opened up the valley as well as across Palestine to Syria. Jerusalem fell to General Allenby in December 1917, and the chief cities of Syria fell the following October 1918. Bulgaria, still smarting from the Second Bulgarian War, 1913, in which it lost territory to Romania, Serbia, Greece, and Turkey, was from the outbreak of the war in 1914 inclined towards Germany and was strengthened in that inclination by the Turkish attack on Russia in October. Both sides tried to buy Bulgaria's allegiance, a process in which the Entente powers were hampered by the fact that Bulgaria's ambitions could be satisfied only at the expense of Greece, Romania, or Serbia, whose support they also desired. Bulgaria wanted Thrace from the Maritsa River to the Vardar, including Kavalya and Saloniki, which were Greek. Most of Macedonia, which was Greek or Serbian, Dobruzha from Romania, and Dobruzha from Romania. The Entente powers offered Thrace to the Vardar in November 1914 and added some of Macedonia in May 1915, compensating Serbia with an offer of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and the Dalmatian coast. Germany, on the other hand, gave Bulgaria a strip of Turkish territory along the Maritsa River in July 1915, added to this a loan of 200 million francs 6 weeks later, and in September 1915 accepted all Bulgaria's demands, provided they were at the expense of belligerent countries. Within a month, Bulgaria entered the war by attacking Serbia October 11, 1915. It had considerable success, driving westward across Serbia into Albania, but exposed its left flank in this process to an attack from the Entente forces, which were already based in Saloniki. This attack came September 1918. Within a month, forced Bulgaria to ask for an armistice September 30th. This marked the first break in the united front of the Central Powers. When the war began in 1914, Romania remained neutral in spite of the fact that it had joined the Triple Alliance in 1883. This adherence had been made because of the Germanic sympathies of the royal family, and was so secret that only a handful of people even knew about it. The Romanian people themselves were sympathetic to France. At that time, Romania consisted of three parts: Moldavia, Wallachia, and Dobruja, and had ambitions to acquire Bessarabia from Russia and Transylvania from Hungary. It did not seem possible that Romania could get both of these, yet that is exactly what happened, because Russia was defeated by Germany and ostracized by the Entente powers after its revolution in 1917, while Hungary was defeated by the Entente powers in 1918. The Romanians were strongly anti-Russian after 1878, but this feeling decreased in the course of time, while animosities against the Central Powers rose because of the Hungarian mistreatment of the Romanian minority in Transylvania. As a result, Romania remained neutral in 1914. Efforts by the Entente powers to win her to their side were vain until after the death of King Carol in October 1914. The Romanians asked, as the price of their intervention in the Entente side, Transylvania, parts of Bukovina, and the Banat of Timesvar, the Banat of Timesvar, I've never heard of that, 500,000 Entente troops in the Balkans, 200,000 Russian troops in Bessarabia, and equal status with the great powers at the peace conference. For this, they promised to attack the Central Powers and not to make a separate peace. Only the heavy casualties suffered by the Entente powers in 1916 brought them to the point of accepting these terms. They did so in August of that year, and Romania entered the war 10 days later. The Central Powers at once overran the country, capturing Bucharest in December. The Romanians refused to make peace until the German advance to the Marne in the spring of 1918 convinced them that the Central Powers were going to win. Accordingly, they signed the Treaty of Bucharest with Germany on May 7, 1918, which they gave Dobruja to Bulgaria, but obtained a claim to Bessarabia, which Germany had previously taken from Russia. Germany also obtained a 90-year lease on the Romanian oil wells. Hold on 1 second. Through the Entente efforts to get Greece into the war were the most protracted and most unscrupulous of the period. Though the Entente efforts to get Greece into the war were the most protracted and most unscrupulous of the period, they were unsuccessful so long as King Constantine remained on the throne. till June 1917. Greece was offered Smyrna in Turkey if it would give Kavala to Bulgaria and support Serbia. Prime Minister Eleutherios Venizelos was favorable but could not persuade the king, and soon was forced to resign in March 1915. He returned to office in August after winning a parliamentary election in June, when Serbia asked Greece for 150,000 men promised in the Serb-Greek Treaty of 1913 as protection against a Bulgarian attack on Serbia. Venizelos tried to obtain these forces from the Entente powers. 4 French-British divisions landed in Saloniki, October 1915, but Venizelos was at once forced out of office by King Constantine. The Entente then offered to cede Cyprus to Greece in favor for Greek support against Bulgaria, but were refused October 20th, 1915, when German and Bulgarian forces began to occupy portions of Macedonia. The Entente powers blockaded Greece and sent an ultimatum asking for demobilization of the Greek army and a responsible government in Athens. June 1916. The Greeks at once accepted, since mobilization made it less likely they could be forced to make war on Bulgaria, and demand for responsible government could be met without bringing Venizelos back to office. This frustrated the Entente powers, established a new provisional Greek government under Venizelos at their base in Saloniki. There he declared war on the Central Powers November 1916. The Entente then demanded that envoys of the Central Powers be expelled from Athens and that war materials within control of the Athenian government be surrendered. These demands were rejected November 30th, 1916. Entente forces landed at the port of Athens, Piraeus, on the same day, but stayed only overnight, being replaced by an entire blockade of Greece. The Venizelos government was recognized by Britain December 1916, but the situation dragged on unchanged. In June 1917, a new ultimatum was sent to Athens demanding the abdication of King Constantine. It was backed up by a seizure of Thessaly and Corinth, and was accepted at once. Venizelos became premier of the Athens government and declared war on the Central Powers the next day, June 27, 1917. This gave the Entente a sufficient base to drive up the Vardar Valley under French General Louis Frachet de Espère and force Bulgaria out of the war. At the outbreak of the war in 1914, Italy declared its neutrality on the grounds that the Triple Alliance of 1882, as renewed in 1912, bound it to support the Central Powers only in the case of defensive war, and that the Austrian action against Serbia did not fall into this category. To the Italians, the Triple Alliance was still in full force, and thus they were entitled, as provided in Article 7, to compensation for any Austrian territorial gains in the Balkans. As a guarantee of this provision, the Italians occupied the Valona district of Albania in November 1914. Efforts of the Central Powers to bribe Italy into the war were difficult because the Italian demands were largely at the expense of Austria. These demands included the South Tyrol, Gorizia, the Dalmatian Islands, and Wallonia, with a Trieste, a free city. A great public controversy took place in Italy between those who supported intervention in the war on the Entente side and those who wished to remain neutral. By skillful expenditure of the money, the Entente governments were able to win considerable support. Their chief achievement was in splitting the normally pacifist Socialist Party by large money grants to Benito Mussolini, a rabid socialist who had been a pacifist leader in the Tripolitan War of 1911. Mussolini was editor of the chief socialist paper Avante. He was expelled from the party when he supported intervention on the Entente side, but using French money, he established his own paper, Popolo d'Italia, and embarked upon an unprincipled career which ultimately made him dictator of Italy. By the Secret Treaty of London, April 26, 1915, Italy's demands as listed above were accepted by the Entente powers and extended to provide that Italy should also obtain Trentino, Trieste, Istria, but not Fiume, South Dalmatia, Albania as a protectorate, the Dodecanese Islands, Adelia in Asia Minor, compensatory areas in Africa if the Entente powers made any acquisition on that continent, a loan of £50 million, part of the war indemnity, and exclusion from the Pope from any of the negotiations leading towards peace. For these extensive promises, Italy agreed to make war on all the Central Powers within a month. It declared war on Austria-Hungary on May 23, 1915, but on Germany only in August 1916. The Treaty of London is of the utmost importance because its ghost haunted the chancelleries of Europe, or I guess it's the chancelleries, I don't know how to pronounce that, of Europe for more than 25 years. It was used as an excuse for the Italian attack on Ethiopia in 1935 and on France in 1940. Well, that makes sense. The Italian war effort was devoted to an attempt to force the Habsburg forces back from the head of the Adriatic Sea. In a series of at least 12 battles on the Isonzo River, Isonzo. Okay. In a series of attacks, at least 12 battles on the Isonzo River, on the very difficult terrain, the Italians were notably unsuccessful. In autumn of 1917, Germany gave the Austrians sufficient reinforcements to allow them to break through onto the rear of the Italian lines at Caporetto. The Italian defense collapsed and was reestablishing along the Piave River only after losses of over 600,000 men, the majority by desertion. Austria was unable to pursue this advantage because of her war weariness, her inability to mobilize her domestic economy successfully for war purposes, and above all by the growing unrest of the nationalities subjects to Habsburg rule. These groups set up governmental committees in Entente capitals and organized legions to fight on the Entente side. Italy organized a great meeting of these peoples at Rome in April 1918. They signed the Pact of Rome, promising to work for self-determination of subject peoples and agreeing to draw their frontier between the Italians and the South Slavs on nationality lines. Russia, like Romania, was forced out of the war in 1917 and forced to sign a separate peace by Germany in 1918. The Russian attack on Germany in 1914 had been completely shattered at the battles of Tannenberg and the Mauritian Lakes, in August and September, but their ability to hold their own against Austrian forces in Galicia made it impossible to bring the war in the east to a conclusion. Russian casualties were very heavy because of inadequate supplies and munitions, while the Austrians lost considerable forces, especially of Slavs, by desertion to the Russians. This last factor made it possible for Russia to organize a Czech legion of over 100,000 men. German reinforcements to the Austrian front in Galicia in 1915 made possible a great Austro-German offensive, which crossed Galicia and by September had taken all of Poland and Lithuania. In these operations, the Russians lost about 1 million men. They lost 1 million more in the Brusilov counterattack in 1916, which reached the Carpathians before it was stopped by the arrival of German reinforcements from France. By this time, the prestige of the Tsarist government had fallen so low that it was easily replaced by a parliamentary government under Kerensky in March 1917. The new government tried to carry on the war, but misjudged the temper of the Russian people. As a result, the extreme communist group known as Bolsheviks were able to seize the government in November 1917 and hold it by promising the weary Russian people both peace and land. The German demands, dictated by the German General Staff, were so severe that the Bolsheviks refused to sign a formal peace, but on March 3, 1918, were forced to accept the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. By this treaty, Russia lost Finland, Lithuania, the Baltic provinces, Poland, the Ukraine, and Transcaucasia. Never even heard of that place. German efforts to exploit these areas in an economic sense during the war were not successful. The Japanese intervention in the war on August 23, 1914, was determined completely by its ambitions in the Far East and the Pacific area. It intended to use the opportunity arising from the great powers concerned with Europe to win concessions from China and Russia and to replace Germany, not only its colonial possessions in the East, but also to take over its commercial position so far as possible. The German island colonies north of the equator were seized at once, and German concession at Kiaochow was captured after a brief siege. In Germany, in 1915, 21 demands were presented to China in the form of an ultimatum and largely accepted. These demands covered accession to the German position in Shantung, extension of Japanese leases in Manchuria with complete commercial liberty for the Japanese in that area, extensive rights in certain existing iron and steel enterprises of North China, and the closing of China's coast to any future foreign concessions. A demand for the use of Japanese advisors in Chinese political, military, and financial matters was rejected and withdrawn. On July 3, 1916, Japan won Russian recognition of its new position in China in return for her recognition of the Russian penetration into Outer Mongolia. New concessions were won from China in February 1917 and accepted by the United States in November in the so-called Lansing-Ishii Notes. In these notes, the Japanese gave verbal support to the American insistence on the maintenance of China's territorial integrity, political independence, and the open-door policy in commercial matters. The outbreak of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, followed by the German victory over that country, and the beginning of civil war gave the Japanese an opportunity in the Far East which they did not hesitate to exploit. With the support of Great Britain and the United States, they landed at Vladivostok. They landed at Vladivostok in April 1918, and began to move westward along the route of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Czech Legion on the Russian front had already rebelled against Bolshevik rule and was fighting its way eastward along the same railroad. The Czechs were eventually evacuated to Europe, while the Japanese continued to hold the eastern end of the railway and gave support to anti-Bolshevik factions in the Civil War. After a year or more of confused fighting, it became clear that the anti-Bolshevik factions would be defeated and that the Japanese could expect no further concessions from the Bolsheviks. Accordingly, they evacuated Vladivostok in October 1922. Undoubtedly, the most numerous diplomatic agreements of the wartime period were concerned with the disposition of the Ottoman Empire. As early as February 1915, Russia and France signed an agreement by which Russia was given a free hand in the East in return for giving France a free hand in the West. This meant that Russia could annex Constantinople and block the movement for an independent Poland, while France could take Alsace-Lorraine from Germany and set up a new, independent state under French influence in the Rhineland. A month later, in March 1915, Britain and France agreed to allow Russia to annex the Straits and Constantinople. The intermediate activities of the Entente powers, however, were devoted to plans to encourage the Arabs to rebel against the Sultan's authority or at least abstain from supporting his war efforts. The chances of success in these activities were increased by the fact that the Arabian portions of the Ottoman Empire, while nominally subject to the Sultan, were already breaking up into numerous petty spheres of authority, some virtually independent. The Arabs, who were completely separate people from the Turks, speaking a Semitic rather than Ural-Altic language, and who had remained largely nomadic in their mode of life, while the Turks had become almost completely a peasant people, were united to the Ottoman peoples by little more than their common allegiances to the Muslim religion. This connection had been weakened by the efforts to secularize the Ottoman state and by the growth of Turkish nationalism, which called forth a spirit of Arabic nationalism as a reaction to it. In 1915 to 1916, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, entered into correspondence with the Sheriff Hussein of Mecca. While no binding agreement was signed, the gist of their discussion was that Britain would recognize the independence of the Arabs if they revolted against Turkey. The area covered by the agreement included those parts of the Ottoman Empire south of the 37th degree of latitude, except Adana, Alexandretta, and those portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, which cannot be said to be purely Arab. In addition, Aden was accepted, while Baghdad and Basra were to have a special administration. The rights of France in the whole area were reserved. The existing British agreements with various local sultans along the shores of the Persian Gulf were to be maintained, and Hussein was to use British advisors exclusively after the war. Extended controversy has arisen from this division of areas, the chief point at issue being whether the statement as worded included Palestine in the area which was granted to Arabs or in the area which was reserved. The interpretation of these terms exclude Palestine from Arab hands was subsequently made by McMahon on several occasions after 1922 and most explicitly in 1937. While McMahon was negotiating with Hussein, the government of India, through Percy Cox, was negotiating with Ibn Saud of Najd and in agreement of December 26, 1915, recognized his independence in return for a promise of neutrality in the war. Shortly afterward, on May 16, 1916, an agreement known as the Sky-Picot Agreement, from the name of the chief negotiator, was signed between Russia, France, and Britain early in 1917. Italy was added to the settlement. It partitioned the Ottoman Empire in such a way that little was left to the Turks except the area within 200 or 250 miles of Ankara. Russia was to get Constantinople and the Straits, as well as northern Anatolia, including the Black Sea coast. Italy was to get the southwestern coast of Anatolia from Smyrna. I don't know what place that is. I guess they changed the name. From Smyrna to Attalia. France was to get most of the eastern Anatolia, including Mersin, Adana, and Sicilia, as well as Kurdistan, Alexandria, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia, including Mosul. Britain was to get the Levant from Gaza south to the Red Sea, Transjordan, most of the Syrian desert, all of Mesopotamia south of Kirkuk, including Baghdad and Barsa, and most of the Persian Gulf coast of Arabia. It was also envisioned that western Anatolia around Smyrna would go to Greece. The Holy Land itself was to be internationalized. The next document concerned with the disposition of the Ottoman Empire was the famous Balfour Declaration of November 1917. Probably no document of the wartime period, except Wilson's 14 points, has given rise to more disputes than this brief statement of less than 11 lines. Much of the controversy arises from the belief that it promised something to somebody, and that this promise was in conflict with other promises, notably with the McMahon Pledge to Sharif Hussein. The Balfour Declaration took the form of a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Rothschild, one of the leading figures in the British Zionist movement. This movement, which was much stronger in Austria and Germany than in Britain, had aspirations for creating in Palestine, or perhaps elsewhere, some territory which refuses from anti-Semitic persecution, or other Jews could go find a national home. Balfour's letter said, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. It is to be noted that this was neither an agreement nor a promise, but merely a unilateral declaration that it did not promise a Jewish state in Palestine, or even Palestine as a home for the Jews, but merely proposed such a home in Palestine, and that it reserved certain rights for existing groups in the area. Hussein was so distressed when he heard of it that he asked for an explanation and was assured by D.G. Hogarth on behalf of the British government that Jewish settlement in Palestine would only be allowed insofar as would be consistent with the political and economic freedom of the Arab population. Wow. Okay. This reassurance apparently was acceptable to Hussein, but doubts continued among other Arab leaders. In answers to a request from 7 such leaders on June 16, 1918, Britain gave a public answer which divided the Arab territories into 3 parts. A. The Arabian Peninsula from Aden to Aqaba, at the head of the Red Sea, where the complete and sovereign independence of Arabs was recognized. B. Under the British military occupation covering southern Palestine and southern Mesopotamia, where Britain accepted the principle that government should be based on the consent of the governed. And C. The area under Turkish control, including Syria and northern Mesopotamia, where Britain assumed the obligation to strive for freedom and independence. Somewhat similar in tone was a joint Anglo-French declaration of November 17, 1918, just 4 days before hostiles ended the war. It promised the complete and final liberation of peoples who have for so long been oppressed by the Turk, and the setting up of national governments and administrations that shall derive their authority from the free exercise of the initiative and choice of the indigenous populations. There have been extended discussions of the compatibility of the various agreements and statements made by the great powers regarding the disposition of the Ottoman Empire after the war. This is a difficult problem in view of the inaccuracy and ambiguity of the wording of most of these documents. On the other hand, certain facts were quite evident. There is a sharp contrast between the imperialist avarice to be found in the secret agreements like Sykes-Picot and the altruistic tone found publicly and the altruistic tone of the publicly issued statements. There is also a sharp contrast between the tenor of the British negotiations with the Jews and those with the Arabs regarding the disposition of Palestine, with the result that the Jews and Arabs were each justified in believing that Britain would promote their conflicting political ambitions in the area. These beliefs, whether based on misunderstanding or deliberate deception, subsequently served to reduce the stature of Britain in the eyes of both groups, although both had previously held a higher opinion of British fairness and generosity than of any other power. Lastly, the raising of false Arab hopes and the failure to reach any clear and honest understanding regarding Syria led to a long period of conflict between the Syrians and the French government, which held as a mandate the League of Nations after 1923. Let me see. A lot. I'm just going to stop right there. I'm on page 248, Tragedy and Hope. We're still in the First World War, 1914 to 1918. This is getting like super deep. Half of these people I never heard of before. Looking at the Balfour Declaration, how that got started. Pretty interesting stuff, though, I gotta say. I'm not like super into history, but it does put a lot of stuff into context as how the whole war got started in between the Europeans and stuff. So I'm gonna get out of here for now. Thanks for checking out the video. Probably someone like 30 years in the future if this channel doesn't get deleted. Otherwise, have a good day and peace.